excuse me for sitting down. It's just kind of the facilities we have. We're going to try to fit everybody in this room if we can. There are seats up front. We're trying to maintain social distancing. We should have 46 people registered attending, so I think we'll be okay. If you don't want to sit in here because you feel too cramped, or you want to go over to the overflow in the banquet room over there just to the east side of the entrance, we've got round tables set up in there, and that's where we're going to be doing lunch. So welcome everybody to this ASCE and Dixie Stormwater Coalition LID training. I'm Clint Merrill. I'm the president of the Southern Utah ASCE branch, and I just wanted to welcome everybody out here and thank you for coming and being interested in this. It's going to be important here in our 4 participating coalition cities coming up. If you're doing any development or redevelopment type work, this is going to be important stuff to know. Just a couple of housekeeping things. For ASCE, we're trying to get back into the swing of things. So if you're an ASCE member, or even if you're not, we want you to participate in our activities. Next month on the 23rd, we're going to be doing a family barbecue at Vernon Worthen Park. It's tentatively at 1 o'clock, and we're not going to charge anything for that. So it's open to engineers and their families to come and learn about ASCE and just have some fun with other engineers in the area. We've rented the pavilion and a couple pickleball courts, and we'll be having pizza and some sweets. Yeah, I'll send out an invite. We'll when we get it all finalized. I've got the stuff reserved at the park, but once we get a little bit closer, I'll send out a mailing list invite like I did before. Hopefully everybody's been getting the emails and that's worked. Okay, I'm going to turn the time over to Melinda with the Dixie Stormwater Coalition. She's going to introduce and talk a little bit and introduce Tom, our speaker.
Hi. I'm the chair of the Dixie Stormwater Coalition, Melinda Gibson. We want to thank Santa Clara City Public Works for hosting the facility to present this to you. Okay.
Trying to minimize the cameras.
So you're here today because our coalition has put together a low impact development guidance manual for the 4 cities, Santa Clara, Ivins, St. George, and Washington, to comply with the EPA's regulation on low impact development. We specifically put together this manual for our area to kind of give you more guidance for our particular soil types in our region down here in Southern Utah. Thank you for coming and supporting us, and we hope that it's informative training for you and that you learn. Make sure that you don't hesitate to ask questions, because that's what we're here for, is so that you learn and take away what you need to start this process of low impact development. So our first speaker, if you have your little sheet, Tom Jorgensen, an engineer with Ivins City, is our first speaker, and he will be presenting to us, followed by, we'll have a brief lunch, which will be probably an intermission for online. And then after that, Clint Merrill with Bowen Collins will be following up with more information on low impact development, followed by a city panel of experts from each city that can answer questions for you at that time as well. Okay, I'll turn the time over to Tom Jorgensen.
Thanks. So probably several of you have seen this presentation before, and what that previous presentation was based off of was a manual that was prepared by the state of Utah. This presentation is a little bit more focused and changed based on the manual that was prepared for the Dixie Coalition. So you'll see some information in here that might be a little bit different than what we showed you before. But the importance about this manual is something that was created for our area, something that's a little more focused. So what you hear today is probably going to supersede anything that you've heard in the past or before. The manual that Melinda talked about and what this presentation is based on is kind of a go-to manual for all of you to reference, read over, look through. It's going to be the basis for your understanding and what the cities are going to expect to see when we start implementing, not when, since we've started implementing LID into new development and into redevelopment. So let's go over first what LID is. What LID is when it rains, we want systems and practices that either mimic or use natural processes that result in one of the three following. So when it rains, we want to mimic the natural process of infiltration. We want to try and mimic the natural process of evapotranspiration, or we want to mimic water reuse. Now, we're not really mimicking reuse because the water is just following. Water reuse is pretty much essentially just another method of infiltration or evapotranspiration. The whole purpose of what the state is asking us to do, the goals for LID is to, one, protect water quality, and two, protect aquatic habitat. So those are kind of the overarching goals coming down from the state. And the infiltration, evapotranspiration, those are the methods by which we're trying to achieve the goals. So when it rains, we're trying to mimic infiltration and evapotranspiration. So how are we going to do that? The number one way that we're going to try and do that is through retaining the runoff from an 80 percentile storm. We want, for 80% of the storms that we see in Washington County, we want zero discharge. It's going to be different from a detention basin. It's 100% retention. We want essentially zero discharge under 80% of the storms that we're going to see. Through the presentation, that rule is called the 80th percentile rule. And just a little history, you might remember that a couple of the past presentations, it used to be 90 percentile rule. And that's been reduced or decreased down to the 80th percentile, which is good news for everybody. This is one of those things that was great to have happen. So we're going to retain 80th percentile, well, 80% of all storms we see in Washington County. Who does that apply to? So all the MS4 communities right now are required to implement LID strategies. Those are St. George, Washington, Ivins, and Santa Clara. We're anticipating that more cities as they grow or whatnot are going to be included in with these MS4 cities, probably Hurricane or maybe Cedar City. But right now in our Dixie Stormwater Coalition, these are the only cities that are participating right now and have the requirement of LID. Who does it affect? Anybody that's going to be developing any portions of land greater than 1 acre in those 4 cities. And also any redevelopment that occurs within those 4 cities. There's a little caveat with redevelopment. We're not going to talk about redevelopment very much because it's just kind of a very specialized section. Most of us are going to be doing new development. But if the impervious surface increases by more than 10% of your redevelopment site, then you retain the net increase associated with that 80th percentile storm. It's a little confusing, but it's not just taking you all the way back to the beginning. It's just whatever increase that you have above what that original development was, that's what you're going to retain. And if you have more questions on that, we could talk after, or you can talk to somebody in the cities, but that one's just a little bit more obscure. But today we're mostly going to be talking about new development. When did this come into effect? It's already in effect, July 1st of 2020. Different cities are going to have different rules, whether or not it's going to apply to their new development. If you're already vested with your development, you're probably not going to have to abide by these LID rules, but certainly any new developments that are just coming through, starting the process from the beginning, are definitely going to have to apply by the LID principles and rules. So how did we obtain the 80th percentile storm event? And how we're going to identify what that storm event is just purely by depth. We're not worried about a 10-year event versus a 100-year event or whatever. It's just what we did is we obtained all the rainfall data for as long as we could go back. We sorted it from high to low. We took out all the data for events that were smaller than 0.1 inch, and then essentially just use a percentile function in Excel. And what that did for us, we're not going to go through the entire process, but for St. George, Washington, Ivins, and Santa Clara, the 80th percentile depth is 0.44 inches. This is just all around. You're not going to have to compute this, calculate it. We just want you to just use this number, 0.44 inches.
Can you guys still see the ride? You like it with the lights off? Can you see that better? Would you rather have the light on? Okay.
So this 0.44 inches is going to be the 80th percentile storm depth. So what that means, if we want zero runoff from 80% of our storms, if you see any storm between 0 and 0.44 inches, you're going to have zero runoff from your site. If you see a storm that's bigger than 0.44 inches, then you'll begin to start seeing runoff from your site. But anything less than 0.44 inches, you should have zero runoff from your site. Entering storm drain systems, washes, the river, it's kind of a big deal. If this is the first time you've heard this, this is kind of a big rule. So now that we know what our percentile depth is, how do we determine what the volume is going to be? So the first step we've already done. We've got the 80th percentile depth. Step 2 is going to be imperviousness, calculating what our imperviousness is. Step 3 is going to be determining what our volumetric runoff coefficient is. I'll talk about that in a second. And then using those 3 parameters, we're going to come up with what our 80th percentile volume is. That's what how much volume we're going to have to put on site in order to retain the 80th percentile depth. First time you see this, you're going to be a little confused. It's going to be scary, but I promise you it's very simple. See a lot of faces just like Jack Sparrow out there. Just kidding. Okay, so number 1, imperviousness. So our project imperviousness is essentially the post-development impervious area divided by the project limits. Pretty simple. So what's included in impervious areas? That's going to be homes, future driveways, concrete work, asphalt, streets, sidewalk, curb gutter, buildings, parking lots, anything that an engineer is going to deem impervious. You're going to say, well, we don't know what kind of homes or flat work is going to be done at the initial stages. We're just expecting you to use engineering judgment and come up with those numbers based on your criteria of what you anticipate seeing there. Step number 2, the volumetric runoff coefficient. In the manual, what we're using are these 2 equations. So I represents your percent impervious that we just calculated in decimal form. And if it's less than 0.55, then you can use that top equation. If it's greater than 0.55, I is greater than 0.55, you use that bottom equation. And what this equation is doing is it's saying, well, we're not going to have 100% runoff of that depth. There's going to be some shallow areas, the asphalt's going to absorb some water. So this is just knocking further down the amount of water that's going to run off that you need to retain. And then how do we calculate the percentile volume? So V goal is our volume goal. That's what we're trying to achieve. And that is just multiplication of the runoff coefficient, the depth in feet, just so we stay in the proper units. And then the last one is the project area. Again, we're going to put it into square feet. So you multiply all those together, that's going to give us our goal for volume that we're going to retain. So we've got a development here. We're going to call this phase 7. We're going to calculate the volume real quick. So over here on the right, we've got 9 10,000 square foot lots, 7 15,000 square foot lots. And then over here on the left, we're going to calculate it. So we got our percentile depth, 0.44 inches. It's easy. Convert that to feet. Imperviousness. I was able to, since this has already been developed, get a good idea of what the imperviousness is actually going to be for this development. Obviously, we're not going to know beforehand, but for this particular one, it's actually 0.52 is our percent impervious. And so we use the equation for less than 0.55. That's the one you see there. This equation here. And then you plug in your 0.52 into that equation, and it's 0.167. For our V goal, we're multiplying all three of those numbers together, and we get our V goal of 1,452 cubic feet. So over here, you see our, if we just did pure calculation of depth times width, it's 3 feet deep, 22 by 22 feet. Gives you kind of an idea how big that's going to be. And then right here, this little green area represents, you guys see that? Okay. So that little green area represents the overall area of that 22 by 22 by 3. So you may be thinking right now, wow, that's a giant area. Some of you may be thinking, wow, that's not a lot. Doesn't matter what you think, that's what it is. Doesn't matter what you think, that's what it is. Okay, so by what means are we going to retain? Any questions up to this point? Right, so the question is this applicable for any development that's less than 1 acre? No, it's not applicable for any development that's less than 1 acre. The caveat is if it's part of a common plan, if it's part of a larger subdivision, then it gets grouped in with that subdivision and it's going to be larger than 1 acre. It's going to have to abide by the LID principles. Not very often do we see any development that's less than 1 acre. It's pretty rare, right? So don't anticipate that it's something that's going to come up very often. Right. So if it's a 0.8 acre commercial site, do we need to abide by LID principles? The answer is no. Is there any credit if we do LID principles? The credit system is tricky. The state does allow for a credit system to be applied. So if you want to get with another developer and say, we're doing LID on this site and this site over here, I think the cities, for the most part, are open to some sort of credit system. I don't think the cities are going to be managing that credit system by having available spots for retention or whatnot. But if an engineer wants to come in and say, we're combining with these, I would imagine that most cities, if not all, are open to that idea, but I'm not going to speak for everybody. That'll be a great panel discussion, though, at the end. So the question is whether or not we can make the retention/detention basins deeper than what our city codes allow. And I would say that our city codes allow only 3 feet, so that's what it's going to be. That means our basins might need to be bigger. And we are saying that we want the systems to operate separately, but if at the bottom of your detention system you want to have a retention portion, that's going to work. It just needs to make sure that the detention portion also works the way it's supposed to too. So no, we can't go any deeper than 3 feet if that's what the city codes require. But we can combine the two facilities together if you can show that neither the detention nor the retention aspects are being affected. Yes, whatever is being presented in your preliminary plans or your plats or whatever as your phase boundary, you can use your project limits to help or hurt you in the LID, depending on what phases. If you have a bunch of open space, you should definitely count that because that's only going to reduce your volume, because remember, your percent impervious could be based on a much higher number than your imperviousness. So don't do anything you feel your engineering judgment wouldn't want you to do, but the whole point is to reduce your percent impervious. So if you're doing that up front, you're already helping yourself by reducing your volumes, if that makes sense. Anything else before we go on? So by what means are we going to be able to retain? So we've got in our manual, the state had a manual with a bunch of BMPs, and the Dixie Coalition has also created a manual, and we've included, I don't know how many of these there are, but a bunch of ideas for ways that we can retain the stormwater. It doesn't have to be a big open retention basin. Obviously, that's a pretty easy one. We can all imagine it, but we have all these other options that we can use to count as retention for meeting that goal. Here's a bunch of exhibits that we're going to go through. So here's your standard retention basin. We're calling it an infiltration basin. You can see that the outlet structure is raised up, so there's no way any of that water can come out until the water level has come up to that point. And at that point, we want water to leave our site based on what our detention requirements are. We still want to use our storm drain systems. This is just an example. You can use these details. We have these details in PDF and CAD format. So if you want to request these details to kind of help you through the process of a design. Here's a rainwater harvest and reuse system. We could do above ground, below ground systems with pumps. They have an overflow that goes into some other areas, maybe a pre-treatment on the downspouts. Here's an infiltration trench along the linear sides of a parking lot or whatnot. Got a perforated pipe here to help us observe what the level of the water is. Now you're saying this is not a complete open volume, but you're going to have to be calculating, determining what the volume of this open graded stone is and what the open area of this pea gravel is, and that's your volume. The intent is for all this water, just like the retention basin, is to seep into the ground. Here's a dry well. Here's an underground infiltration gallery, very similar to a retention basin, same principles, except for now it's below ground. Here's some pervious surfaces, paver patios, paver streets, paver centers. Here's a rain garden. And I want to stop here for just a second. You can see that this rain garden here on the left has a permeable liner. So we've got a volume that's above ground, and then there's also a volume that we can calculate that's below ground that's been engineered to try and mimic the natural percolation. But then that water is expected to go into the ground through this permeable liner. But then over on this right-hand side, it's a pretty much exact same system, except for now we have a method by which the water does not go into the ground, if we have circumstances where we don't want the water to go in the ground, but it goes out to our drainage system. So it's got an impermeable liner. You can imagine that we want these kinds of systems, maybe if we've got expansive soils, or we want to put it right next to our roadway, but we don't want to compromise the roadway section. But what we're trying to achieve here is the goal of mimicking the natural systems of infiltration, percolation, filtration before it goes into our storm drain systems. Bioretention cells, very similar to these rain gardens. Again, you might have some barriers here to try and prevent water from going where you want it to go. This one's got a hard bottom on it. This one's got an open bottom on it. Different applications. Bioswales, put these in parking lots, down the center lines of your roadways, on the sides of your sidewalks and curbs and gutters. Vegetative strips. There's some studies out there that kind of show what as water's flowing over these vegetative strips, how much actually gets percolated into the ground. Well, that volume should be counted. So if you're running it over some sort of rock or grass or landscaping, that volume should be calculated and counted as your total volume that you're doing for your site. Tree boxes. You can see these tree boxes have concrete walls on all 4 sides and bottom. You can also do these without a bottom and not have the connection to the storm drain system. Okay, any questions about these example BMPs? Pretty straightforward. Now the manual that the Dixie Stormwater Coalition has put out, we don't have a lot of equations for calculating what the volumes of these are going to be. The state's manual does, and then the EPA manual on their website has a lot of literature for how to calculate volumes for these types of stuff. Just use your engineering judgment for what you think is applicable and what's not. So we've got this new development that's coming in, pretty standard catch basins, storm drain systems going out to the existing roadways. So what is LID going to look like in this kind of a subdivision? Well, we've got this bioretention cell that we're looking at. We've got the volume of all these different layers. We're going to come up with a volume that is going to go to that. And we're going to say to ourselves, which one of these BMPs are going to work for us? And in our manual, we've put together this matrix to help you understand which BMPs are going to work for you and on your very specific site and which ones aren't. We want you to use this matrix at all different levels of planning. In the manual, there's a bunch of maps in there that show what the hydrologic soil groups are, where we anticipate seeing groundwater depth. So at the very, very preliminary level, you should be pulling these out when you're meeting with your client and say, our depth of bedrock is really shallow. So this is going to limit some of the things we're going to be able to do with our subdivision with LID. The soils in this area are not permeable. We're not going to be able to infiltrate water into the ground. So a lot of our options are going to be taken away from us. But at every level, we want you to use this matrix to help you identify which BMPs are going to be able to be used on your specific site. So you can see here, step 1, you're going to look at depth to bedrock. And you're going to say, is the depth to bedrock acceptable? Groundwater depth, is this acceptable? If not, it's going to run you down different systems. So we'll follow the yes for right now. Then after you look at your vertical clearances from bedrock and groundwater depth, we're going to look at the native soils. What are the infiltration rates? At the very preliminary stages, you might look at our maps and our thing and say, oh, well, it's very clear we're going to be in clay soils. Right off the bat, we're going to be thinking a little bit differently than if we're in an area that has very great soils for infiltration. Kind of get your mindset just starting to go one way or the other. Yes, we're passing all these. Everything's looking good. What about our horizontal clearances? Are we going to be able to get 5 feet within a building, 20 feet within a building, 40 feet within a building? What about our roads, our pipelines? What about the existing infrastructure that's there? Are we going to be able to put some of these things below ground? Ideally, you'd take each one of these BMPs and you run it through this matrix. And if it turns out you get all yeses and you come to here and you go, okay, well, they're all good. This BMP is acceptable for this site. And it should be not necessarily used, but in your toolbox for this is a BMP we can use. Let's use it or not, just depending on whether or not you feel like you need to. So now if we run through these no's, they all end up in one spot. Here it says, does the BMP have an option for an under drain system? Now you might be saying, well, if I get a no, why am I ending up here? Well, you're getting a no for a reason. Maybe your depth of groundwater is too shallow and you don't want to be putting that water into the groundwater. Well, if there's an under drain system, that means you got an impermeable layer and you're sending all that water now to a storm drain system instead of into the ground. Now your depth of groundwater doesn't really matter. Now you're sending it to a storm drain system. So yes, okay, let's look at the outfall locations, because if you have an under drain system, you're going to need to be sending it to either a channel, storm drain, placed above grade. If that's still not available to you, if it is, then it's a usable BMP. If it's not, then you're going to end up here. If you go through all your BMPs, if there's not an under drain system and you come up here, the selected LID BMP is not applicable within this region. You're not going to put that BMP as one of your tools for your toolbox. Now in the end, in the event that all listed BMPs in the matrix are infeasible, the applicant shall propose an alternative approach to meet the LID requirements. And I'm going to talk about this here in just a second, but there's some options for us outside these actual BMPs that we can do to still try and meet the requirement. If you're here and you don't have any BMPs that are going to work, we're saying you're still not off the hook. We still want you to do, I'll talk about it in just a second. And then along with this matrix, we've got this table. And this is what's meant to help us. So I'll take you through one of these. Let's say you're looking at a rain garden. We want to make sure that our groundwater is at least greater than 10 feet if we're going to be putting in a rain garden. Bedrock's at least greater than 5 feet. We want to make sure that we're in hydraulic soil groups A or B. We want to make sure our infiltration rates are 0.5. So this is kind of your cheat sheet as you're going through that matrix to say, what about the bedrock? You can look here and say, oh, they're saying if it's greater than 5 feet, then we're okay. If it's not, then we're going to say no and move on. So this is a pretty daunting table, but it's meant to just kind of help you along the way as you're going through the matrix. Any questions on the matrix and its use or effectiveness? Again, this matrix is going to be used through the different levels of planning. In the very initial stages, you're going to be using the maps maybe in our guidelines. But as you move farther along, now you're going to be using your recommendations from your geotech and what they're telling you. Maybe they're saying, no, the 10 foot to groundwater is unacceptable. We're going to have to go deeper or more shallow. Or maybe they're going to say that, yeah, on your preliminary maps, it says A or B, but it's actually a C. Let's look at something different. Maybe you're not quite getting the infiltration rates that you were wanting. So as you're moving along the process, use better and better information to help you make your decisions. So for that development. We've got all these BMPs that we've decided we want to use. Our permeable pavement, we're getting 349 cubic feet of volume to count. And in total, we've got 5183 volume from all these BMPs. Now we've met our goal. We're going to put, our dry well up here. We're going to put some permeable pavement at our entrances. We're going to do some rain gardens along the side and bioswales. So now instead of our initial development looking like this, now we've got a development with LID principles incorporated into it. This is a pretty complicated system. We're not saying that you need to use 7 or 8 BMPs to qualify. You can use 1 or you can use 10, as long as we're doing our best to meet our goal. Any questions so far? Okay, now we're going into this little box here that I read. If all your BMPs are infeasible, we need an alternative approach. I'm going to read these couple paragraphs. Technical infeasibility. This guidance document and matrix are intended to assist the user to work through feasibility of the Utah BMPs for use within this Dixie Stormwater Coalition region. According to the UPDES permit from the state of Utah, infeasibilities which should be considered technical are listed as high groundwater, drinking water source protection, soil conditions, slopes, and others. So those are our technical infeasibilities that are making us run through our matrix and hitting no every time. So in accordance with the Utah DWQ permit, alternative approaches from the retention requirement will only be allowed with a site-specific engineering study that demonstrates infeasibility based on insurmountable constraints and may be permitted on a case-by-case basis. An alternative approach will require that retention and BMPs are incorporated to the maximum extent feasible. So if you can get 60% of your goal volume, we want you to do that. If it's 100% infeasible to get that remaining 40%, we still want you to do the 60%, which includes disconnecting impervious area for the permit. This may include a reduction in the required retention volume permitted as long as verifiable documentation can be provided to adequately show that the proposed plan will meet our goals of protecting stormwater quality and reduce the discharge of pollutants into the MS4. Any questions about technical infeasibility? At this point, technical infeasibility might be a great topic at the end when we have our panel. So documentation is a love letter to your future self. This is what the cities are going to be very strict about. We want you guys to do your job, but in the end of the day, we need to be able to prove to the state of Utah and the EPA that we're doing the best that we can. And the only way that we can do that is through documentation. In the manual, there's a couple of these sheets. I've kind of got them blown up so we can see them a little bit better as we go through the slides. So we're going to be asking for stuff like the total development area, the volumetric coefficient, percentile volume, depth to groundwater. We want you to be determining what all these things are so that when state comes to us and says, how come they didn't do all that they needed to do? Well, we can return to these documents and say, well, here's where it's laid out. Soil infiltration rates, hydrologic soil groups, protection areas. This is where you're going to start computing what all of your BMPs are and how much volume you're going to get from each one of those. I can imagine that your supporting documentation is going to be a little bit bigger than just these 2 pages because we need to be able to see the documentation behind these calculations and whatnot. Percent of V goal captured by the LID BMPs, we hope to see 100%. And if not 100%, we want you to document your technical infeasibilities and compliance with the measures. So site practice designs. This is kind of going into the realm of if you can't get the volumes that you're required, well, and maybe we can only get 60% of the volume. The state is also going to want us to see just some best practices stuff that have nothing to do with maybe the volumes per se, but more just good site work stuff. What does that mean? Well, let's try and reduce the impervious surfaces. If you come in and say, well, we're doing all this, and then all of a sudden you say, well, we're going to scale it back, that should count as like your design principles, and you should tell us that's what you're doing to try and meet these LID requirements, so we can tell the state, no, this was their original plan. They tried really hard to reduce impervious surfaces. This is the route that they're going to go. Disconnect impervious surface areas, disconnecting rooftop, and distributing that runoff. So this is what Clint's going to be talking about today. In a lot of the documents around, it's kind of hard to put a number to that, but Clint's going to kind of run you through and show you how to put a number to that. So you can count that as your volume, especially for our area here in Washington County. If you're putting soil compost amendments in your landscaping, that's kind of a hard volume to calculate, but if you put that in as one of your leading practices, then we're going to love it. State's going to love it. EPA is going to love it. Obviously, that soil is going to absorb a lot more water than just our normal desert soils. Curb cuts, stormwater landscaping. You know, we see these types of things more and more these days, especially when we start leaving Utah. I've got on here narrow streets, narrow sidewalks. Obviously, everybody wants to have the least amount of improvements as possible, but we got to remember that we're still abiding by the standards from the cities. So if a city says cul-de-sac 96 feet, we still do 96 feet. We're not just going to say we're going to 50 feet just so we can get our LID under control. All right, sort of feel like everybody just wants to throat punch me to the face or the neck. Just remember, you're trying to get right with the Lord. Love this meme. Let's have a little bit of a discussion. Before we get in a little bit of a discussion, we've got about 10 minutes or so. Any questions up until this point? In the back. So the question is this presentation directly from the Stormwater Coalition manual? Yes, it is. So all the stuff has kind of been updated. Keep going. It's a good catch. Definitely need to change that. Where did we see that? Oh, the manual is updated. So it looks like I've got a not quite current copy of the manual. So you're right, this is definitely 80% tile, not 90th. Any other questions? I would imagine that every city is going to be different. That's probably a good topic for the panel discussion. We want our streets to meet our design criterias and whatnot. And if we can't get that from a permeable pavement, then we probably shouldn't be doing it. But our entrances to a private community, sure. Private roads, yeah. Maybe even parking lots. They're being maintained by the owner. We're open to parking lots. Sure. while they're trying to figure out that question, most of our audience today are engineers. We need to remember that our responsibility as engineers is to make sure that our clients are educated as soon as possible. From the city's standpoint, we don't love being the guy that when we're halfway through the planning process and we bring up LID, it's just a bit of a shock to the system. LID is one of those things that it could be a big deal for your developer or it might not be, just depending on how it gets implemented by you, the engineers. From your guys' standpoint, is there anything that the city should be doing or?
Tom, there was one question on the chat. It was, the manual says hydrologic soil groups A, B, and C mostly. Doesn't really address D. There's areas where there's other types of soil, so it wants to know how that's going to be addressed.
I think what we're saying is if it's a hydrologic soil group D, there's not a whole lot of options outside of putting in a impervious barrier below your BMPs. Is that fair to say from the coalition? That's one of the reasons why hydrologic soil group D is just one of those that is going to be tough. Yeah. Yep. And so, yeah. Yes. So the purpose of the maps in the back are 100% just there for extreme preliminary design. You're meeting with your client in 5 minutes and you want to bring up LID and you look on those maps and you say, we don't know what soil groups are here, but let's look at this map and let's talk about it. It's mostly just a starting point for you guys to talk to your clients about, something to get in your head right off the bat. And then the better information you get through the process, you should be using the better information from your geotech studies. It's a good point. So educating our clients, any ideas out there, what the best method to do that is? You guys want to help each other out on how to do that? As early as possible. Yeah, I think maybe.
I just want to chime in real quick though and go back to what Rick was saying about geotechnical report. You know, it's going to be a lot more important, I think, from all the city's perspectives that the geotech report pays special attention to LID where it's not something that they've done in the past. So when you're preparing your scope for your geotech, you need to add in there that, you know, if you're in a badlands type soil or an unclassified type D soil, or you have any doubt about what type of soil it is, try to get some infiltration tests. And then you have something that you can back up. So, you know, maybe it comes back and says your infiltration is ridiculously low. You can document that, and then that now becomes basis for a technical and feasibility. It could come back the other way too, though. It could come back as a type A or a B, but it's just going to help you in your design of your BMPs. And then also associated with that is we're going to be keeping water on the site now. And we hear from a lot of geotechs that, you know, we don't want water next to the structure. Well, they need to pay special attention to that and provide a recommendation in their report regarding LID. If it's a site where soils are collapsible or expansive and they don't want water anywhere near the foundation of the structure, they need to state that in the geotech report and provide justification. And that's what the cities are going to be looking for as far as justification for, you know, evaluating what BMPs. So in a place like that, maybe we could put a BMP somewhere else on the site away from all the structures, and that needs to be a site-wide BMP rather than a local to each lot BMP.
Yeah. You can imagine these BMPs can be anywhere and everywhere, and they can be hard or they can be easy. From a city standpoint, we want it to be as easy as possible. These maintenance agreements, we could have a whole presentation on maintenance agreements. We're going to anticipate that when you're submitting these BMPs and we're going through the process of getting your develop approved and construction drawings approved, we're going to be requiring maintenance agreements in the process. And before any construction begins on your project, we're hoping to probably have these in line before we do anything. Yep. So these documents are probably going to have to run with the land. So any HOA that gets created is going to have to abide by these maintenance agreements that were created as part of the land. Any comments on your guys' ends about maintenance agreements? We're probably going to be looking to the engineers, and the clients are probably going to be looking to the engineers to prepare these. And it's going to be a rough, rocky road because we're not really familiar with a lot of what maintenance can be required for these BMPs. If they're in people's front yards, is the HOA going to maintain those? Are the homeowners going to maintain them? Yep. Yep. These volumes can't disappear when a homeowner develops their lot. You can see from the city standpoint, this looks very scary on the maintenance side. And we might not be allowing the city to maintain some of them. We're going to be requiring them that the HOA maintains them. But that's going to be very variable depending on the city and their requirements. Documentation is going to be a big deal. When we get audited, they don't really want to hear what we have to say. They just want to see what we have documented. Anything else we want to discuss? Talk about questions? We've got about 3 minutes. Okay, this is so exciting.
All right, if we don't have any more questions, thanks, Tom.
Yeah.
We have got lunch set up in the banquet room. So we'll just adjourn here. We're going to go over there. You can grab your lunch, sit at one of the round tables in there, and then we'll have 15 minutes to grab your lunch and get situated and scarf if you want to be done. But I think I'm going to present from sitting down in there at the laptop in there. So you guys take your time, and I'll just present in that room. And then when we're done with lunch, we'll come back into here real quick, and the city panel will be up here, and they'll each get a little bit of time to talk about their perspective on this, and then we'll have a little bit of time for question. Unfortunately, we're not going to have a ton, but we will have some time. So let's head over and get some lunch.
One second, let me go on.
I got a flash drive with it.
I need to make it so we can share the screen.
Perfect.
Cities aren't really heading down.
That's fine. We don't lose
Okay.
Is it
So
unmuted?
we don't, yeah, I unmuted this in here, but muted that. When we start there, you know, that.
Okay.
But so I'll go in there and make sure.
Okay. All right, guys, we're gonna get started here real quick. We're about 5 to 7 minutes behind, and I got a bunch of stuff to go through, so. You guys ready to go? Okay, I don't know if Zoom can hear me, but hopefully you can. Let's see if I can. Okay, I'm unmuted. Should have some audio, so we should be good. All right. Okay, so I'm Clint Merrill. I'm gonna sit down and do this so I can run the computer. And those of you on Zoom, doesn't matter because you can't see me anyway. So we're gonna get going. All right, so thanks, Tom. Tom gave us a high-level overview of LID going forward here in the Dixie Stormwater Coalition. He talked about a bunch of different BMPs. I'm gonna go through and let's see, I'm gonna give you a little bit of background, not much. Then I'm gonna talk a little bit about that local guidance that we have, which Tom really hit that. Then I'm gonna specifically talk about directly connected impervious area and disconnecting those directly connected impervious areas. Now that's a method that's mentioned in the state manual, but they don't give any guidance on how to calculate how much volume you're saving or how much volume you're reducing the runoff by disconnecting your impervious areas. They just kind of say, yeah, this is a good practice, but don't give you any guidance on how to calculate that. So that's what we were brought on to do. Was the Stormwater Coalition wanted a method that they could use, that engineers in the area could use to say, hey, by disconnecting or requiring all my connected or some of my connected impervious areas to be disconnected, I'm reducing runoff by X number of cubic feet. So that's what we're gonna hopefully get to today, how to do that. And I'm sure you're gonna have a lot of questions. You're really gonna earn your continuing education credits today because we got a lot of calculators. It's only adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing, but still, there's a lot of numbers that'll be flashing on screen when we get in there later. Okay, so the state MS4 permit is, I just have that on the screen here. And it says that, we have to, the coalition needed to define a specific hydrologic method or methods for calculating runoff volumes and flow rates. So, we've got the methods that are in the manual with the runoff coefficient that Tom went over, and then we'll have another method for disconnected impervious areas that I'll go over today. And if you read through this, this just kind of reiterates that If you're disturbing land greater than or equal to 1 acre, you got to manage the rainfall on site. This is just the language that says you have to infiltrate, evapotranspire, harvest, or reuse that rainwater. In the coalition member jurisdiction, the 80th percentile storm is 0.44 inches, and this depth uses more than 100 years of rainfall records for St. George. I think it's actually like 127 years of rain gauge data for St. George. And they just run a formula that says, 80% of all storms are this much or less. There are 2 manuals that I'll just briefly introduce. We've got the guide to low impact development within Utah from the DEQ or the DWQ, Utah DWQ. And then we've got the green infrastructure and low impact development application guidelines for Washington County, Utah. And I just got a screenshot here of the 2. You got the state manual on the left, and then the coalition basically took that state manual and kind of reviewed the recommendations that were in there and made some extra recommendations that had a perspective unique to the arid environment and to unique soils and conditions that we have here in Washington County. I'll send out this presentation to everybody that's attending. Hopefully I got your email addresses, or I probably have a record somewhere of it, but if you want it and you're afraid you're not going to get it, just make sure you write your email address on one of the sign-in sheets. I'll make sure you get it. The Stormwater Coalition took that table. This table 2 is basically all the BMPs that are in the state manual, and it's hard to see on this screen up there, but there are some green highlighted rows on there. BR2, BR4, BR5, ID3, and HR1 were identified by the coalition as kind of their preferred BMPs. Doesn't mean you can't use the other ones, just they're making the recommendation. We see these as probably most applicable to our area. And the state asked them to adopt a minimum of 5 BMPs, or each MS4 to adopt a minimum of 5 BMPs are acceptable for use. And again, you can use the other ones, but these are just some that they're thinking are applicable to our area. You've seen this already. This is the decision matrix. I won't talk about that much. You've also seen this. This is the flow chart. Now, when you get into this flow chart and you're working your way through it, on the top right there, there's a green box, and in that green box says that there's an alternative approach. There's a section in the manual that talks about, other alternatives are acceptable. They just need to be documented. So if you get through this and you can think of something innovative that you want to do, you can use one of these alternate methods. And then I'm going to talk about one alternate method, which is disconnecting connected impervious areas. Okay, so this is a quote from the manual. It says that in the event that a proposed retention-based LID practice is not applicable to the site, the minimum requirement within the Dixie Stormwater Coalition region is to disconnect impervious areas. If the water quality retention volume is not met by disconnecting impervious areas, an alternative approach to LID that meets the water quality objectives shall be considered. So go through all your BMPs and then also consider this disconnecting impervious areas as a bare minimum. If you don't want to use any of those other BMPs, you can use this one. And then even if this one doesn't work and you don't want to use this one, they're open to other alternatives. But that's going to be up to the engineer to develop those alternatives and present them. So now I'm going to talk a little bit, how do we disconnect impervious areas and how do we quantify the runoff volume reduction from disconnecting them? First, what is a directly connected impervious area? So a directly connected impervious area, or a DCIA, you'll see that acronym a lot, is defined as a surface where stormwater conveys from an impervious cover, land cover, to a storm drain or a waterway. So this would be, here we're showing that rainfall running on a roof and there's a gutter, goes down a spout onto a pavement and into a storm drain. There was no chance for that runoff from that impervious area to infiltrate or evapotranspire or anything like that. So it's just basically everything, almost every piece of water that hits that impervious, that surface, is making it into the storm drain and leaving the site. Okay, what's a disconnected impervious area? A disconnected impervious area is a surface where stormwater runs off into a permeable area such as a lawn. So this is taken right out of an ASCE, both of these figures are right out of an ASCE publication I've got a link to there. But here, the runoff hits the roof, goes down the spout, and then hits a lawn, and then travels over a certain distance across that lawn before it makes it to the curb and gutter or an inlet or anything that then conveys it to a final outfall point without being able to infiltrate. It has an opportunity to do it, some infiltration and some evapotranspiration. That lawn isn't specifically graded to trap water on the lawn. It's just we're trying to get the water, instead of going onto the driveway and then to the parking lot, to go over some of the landscaping first and then go into the parking lot. And then higher flows are just going to go right over it. They're not going to infiltrate much, and they're going to go in just like they always have. Okay, now in looking at this and in looking at other jurisdictions that have been doing this longer than we have, we came up with a couple of criteria that are kind of commonly accepted for at what point is it disconnected? If I run water over 5 feet of a park strip and then into a curb and gutter, is that disconnected? Well, not really, because you didn't give it much time to infiltrate. So we got some minimum criteria in here for what's considered disconnected. So the runoff from the unconnected or disconnected impervious area has to sheet flow. So you don't not put it into a ditch, an earthen ditch, and then into the storm drain. You're letting it spread out and then be channelized again after it's flowed over some impervious area. Upon entering the downstream impervious area, the runoff has to remain as sheet flow. So again, you can't have a ditch that's grassed and call that an infiltration or a disconnected impervious area. Flow from the impervious area has to enter the downstream. Flow from the impervious surface has to enter the downstream pervious area as sheet flow, or in the case of roofs, from downspouts equipped with splash pads, level spreaders, or dispersion trenches that reduce flow velocity and induce sheet flow. I mean, these first three are kind of all the same thing. Discharges into the downstream pervious surfaces have to be stable and non-erosive. So again, you want something to spread your flow out and spread it out so it's not eroding the surface that it's going onto, gravel, mulch, or something like that. The shape slope of the vegetated cover in the downstream pervious area has to be sufficient to maintain sheet flow throughout its length. And again, we've just adopted the maximum slope as 8%. So we're saying if you go over that 8%, you can't guarantee that it's not small channelized flow, right? Or it hasn't developed rills and things like that. We're kind of saying that is kind of the cutoff for where we think sheet flow is going to transition from sheet flow to shallow concentrated flow. And then one last caveat is that maximum roof area that can be drained by a single downspout is 600 square feet. So if you have a big commercial roof and it all drains to one downspout, you're going to have to kind of split that up a little bit or do some special justification for why you think that that's still going to be considered disconnected. In addition, your unconnected impervious areas have to maintain sheet flow across the downstream pervious area. It has to be 25 feet. The maximum sheet flow length is 100 feet, because after 100 feet, it's going to have enough runoff. It's going to start to become shallow concentrated flow. That's kind of like your curve number method, your TR55 guidance. And then the total length of flow may be greater than maximum sheet flow length across the downstream pervious area can be used to compute the resultant runoff volume is 150 feet. It's just saying that if you have multiple areas, you're going to be limited to 150 feet. I know we're going through this kind of fast, but I'm going to make myself available for questions after, and you can email me as well. This is a design guide drawing that the Stormwater Coalition put together that kind of summarizes some of those requirements, not all of them. You still need to refer to the memo and to the manual to get all the requirements, and each city is going to try to enforce these the best they can, and they're going to have their own interpretation of how strict to enforce them. But again, we're trying to set a minimum standard here. This kind of just shows a gutter going onto a spreader, going across gravel or a lawn, and then going into a curb and gutter. So then I have a little quiz. This is my house. So is that a directly connected impervious area, or is it a disconnected impervious area? Any guesses? Directly connected. Winner, chicken dinner. Well, I'm not redeveloping my site, so the permit doesn't apply to me. And I'm also less than an acre. Okay, this one may be a little bit trickier. Directly connected or disconnected? Okay, I'm hearing kind of both. The answer is, I would say it's directly connected. because the flow path from that flexible pipe to my yard drain is like 3 feet, 2 feet. Goes into that drain, goes through a pipe to the back of my sidewalk, goes over a 3-foot park strip and into the curb and gutter. There's really no chance for that to infiltrate, unless maybe I could put that yard drain into some underground retention area, but then you're kind of implementing one of those other BMPs. It's not really the same as this BMP. And these are all from my house. I have all these conditions. Okay, how about this one? Okay, this one I would say is probably disconnected, although it wasn't designed to be that way. One thing I would do to improve it is I just have one of those spreaders from Home Depot sitting there at the downspout, so it only spreads out about 6 inches. It hits that mow band and then probably spreads out a little bit more. And then I think I have 27 feet across the lawn and across the sidewalk and the other park strip to get into the curb and gutter. So it's probably could be counted as disconnected. I might do a little bit of work to make a better flow spreader, maybe make it go into a little 3-inch lip and build up some head and then flow over as a weir or something like that. So there's ways that that could be improved, but I'd say this is disconnected. Okay, so blazing through this, I got 25 minutes left. And we have talked about our background. We've talked about the local guidance. Really, Tom did the heavy lifting on that. We talked about what a disconnected impervious area is and what a directly connected impervious area is. Now we're going to run through some example calculations. Now I know we've already kind of been getting questions on, you know, you guys all have this handout or could have grabbed this handout. This is in the appendix of my memo that's included in the LID manual from the coalition. There's a bunch of tables like this and there's a ton of numbers on them and it's intimidating. So I gave you this so that if you want to, you can kind of refer to it. We're going to kind of walk through the calculations that created this table and give you an example, and then that'll hopefully give you the tools you need, to dive back into it and kind of really understand what's going on and what calculations we're doing here. So here's a link. This link will take you directly to the coalition's website and to the low impact development section where you can download this memo. It's available separately and also available as part of the larger manual. We're going to first talk about a site-specific analysis, which is a bunch of calculations, and then we also have an approximate method which saves you some time, but it's probably going to underrepresent the reduction you're going to get. So it's conservative in that it's saying you're getting less reduction than you actually probably are. So if you want the most bang for your buck, you want to do a site-specific analysis. Okay, so here's just a picture. This is a lot. I just grabbed a lot out in Washington Fields or Washington City somewhere, and it was a developed lot. Now I have the benefit of knowing what surfaces are on that lot, and I'm looking at one single lot rather than a development. So you as the engineer are going to have to figure out how to take these methods and apply them on a subdivision basis. And hopefully what you get from looking at these calculations is some recommendations on what's typical for percent impervious in our area. I've seen a lot of reports come in that I've reviewed that we're pulling numbers right off of the TR55 curve number tables. Those tables make an assumption of how much, lost my mic. How do you turn it on the bottom? Try that. Perfect. Okay, thanks. So again, you're going to have to, if you look through these examples, it'll kind of give you an idea of some of the sites that I looked at. Percent impervious ranged from 55 to 80% impervious. Those tables in TR55 for residential 1/4 acre lots assume, I think, like 35% impervious. So they're a lot less pervious, or they're more pervious than the lots we typically get in Washington County are. So I would just say, if to anybody who's reviewing those, just take special care looking at curve numbers as they come in, that the percent impervious for the curve numbers they're using really represents the percent impervious of the development that's going in. And there are equations in TR 55 and the NRCS National Engineering Handbook that will help you get to a better curve number. They actually give you an equation that says take your percent impervious, plug it in, and I'll give you a better curve number that accounts for that percent impervious. So we're not going to go into that here, but I can definitely help you with that offline. Okay, so here I've gone through and I've identified, various land covers. I've got grass highlighted in green, unconnected impervious areas that sheet flow off into a grass or gravel is yellow. Red would be a roof. I distinguish roofs. And then purple is a directly connected impervious. It goes, anything that hits that goes across an impervious surface, gets into the storm drain. And then anything that's not colored is, I just said was other pervious. Really, it's rock mulch is what I used. Okay, for a site-specific analysis, these steps are numbered, and in the memo, there's also numbers. These correspond. So if you wanted to get that memo or the manual out, you could follow along this PowerPoint with those steps, and it should correlate 1-to-1. Identify your 80th percentile storm. We already know that, 0.44 inches. Now determine your hydrologic soil type. And this is where you're gonna have to, again, use engineering judgment. You can use the NRCS maps, but if you're in a badlands area or something like that, rockland, something that doesn't really have a hydrologic soil group attached to it, you're really gonna wanna go out there and look at the soil and have it tested and understand what your underlying natural conditions are. We're gonna assume in these calculations, you'll see the table has soil type A, B, C, and D. I just ran through calculations for each site, assuming it was one of those 4 types each time to kind of show what the differences are in the numbers. We're going to assume type D for this example, so we focus on the bottom section of this table. Okay, you're going to first do your undeveloped runoff volume. I think everybody should know how to do this that's done this. You're going to select a curve number from TR 55 or in our NEH 630, that's your tables where I mentioned. And most locations in desert in Washington County, undeveloped condition are going to be desert in some kind of hydrologic condition. And again, you have to make that based on aerial photographs, site visits. Does it have 30% coverage vegetation between 30 and 70, I think the cutoff is, or more than 70? That's going to determine if you're poor, fair, or good. I assume based on aerials of this site before it was developed that I was fair, that I had somewhere between 30 and 70% covered in creosote or grasses or something like that. So I went to the TR 55 tables. Type D soil, undeveloped, desert, fair condition is 86. So for my undeveloped condition, I'm using 86. Okay, now here's where the numbers are going to start flying at you, but hopefully you already have tools that you're already using to do curve number method. This just kind of gets you into the nitty gritty of calculating volumes using the curve number method. We're not going to talk about peak discharges. We're just talking about total volume of runoff. So you're going to follow along with NEH 630. You're going to take your curve number, plug it into an equation. You're going to get your maximum potential storage. That's the maximum that your site is assumed to be able to store in local depressions or trees and lawns and things like that, just in the natural condition. That's 1.63. Then you're going to say, okay, when I have a storm, I have initial abstraction. That's all the storms that happen right at the beginning of the storm. And then once those pools fill up and trees have taken up what they're going to take up and bushes have taken that up, I'm going to be left with that's the total initial abstraction. So we're going to just make the assumption that's 0.2 times our maximum storage potential. So we're going to get 0.33 inches. So in this case, because our initial abstraction is less than 0.44 inches, that means that there's still 0.11 inches that are going to not be filled in those depressions and it's going to run off our site. Now we're going to figure out how much volume that creates. And then there's an equation in the NRCS methods that you can see there. I plugged them in. I can't really point on screen here, but you can see I've plugged in 0.44 for our precip under P and our initial abstraction. And when you get that all out, you get 0.008 inches. Man, that's almost nothing, right? And then what then you have to do is, okay, I have a small site, so this is still going to probably be nothing, but I need to convert that based on my area. I'm going to take that 0.008 inches times the area of my storm or my lot, my development, and I'm going to do some unit conversions, and I'm going to get 6 cubic feet. Okay, so technically, you know, where we've said that you can't have any runoff in the 0.44 inches, technically on this site, you could allow 6 cubic feet of water to run off your site because in the undeveloped condition, there was already 6 cubic feet of runoff. Now, this is why it's beneficial to do this, because if your particular site is in, say, a poor hydrologic condition and it's a type D soil, you might have 200 cubic feet running off. And now you've just reduced the amount that you actually have to retain from that 0.44 inches. Making sense so far? Okay. Oh, I think I went too far. Okay. Now we're going to move on to doing, okay, what's our runoff if all of our directly connected impervious areas connected? Our roofs are directly connected to our driveways or our yard drains. What's our runoff going to be? So this is like worst case. So we're assuming a site plan's available. Again, you're going to have to make assumptions, but I've just got a table here that tabulates all the various types, and we're going to use this table as we move on. I've just kind of drawn it in. Now, if I was doing this off of a plan or just a site plan, I would have to make an assumption that says, based on typical lots that I've done in the past or similar subdivisions, we're going to have roofs that are about this many square feet or this percentage of the total lot, and this much of it's going to be lawn and this much of it's going to be gravel and xeriscaping essentially. Okay, now this just, I kind of throwing a caution up here, and I already talked about this a little bit, that your first inclination is just going to calculate a composite curve number based on area weighting. That's what we all have done in the past. Or you're just going to pick something from that table that says, oh, I have residential quarter acre lots. I'm going to use a curve number of 80, type D soils or something. Okay, well, again, that table is assuming a 30% or a 35% impervious area, but really in this site, I've done the calculation, I have 64% impervious, so that number doesn't apply to my site. And then the other thing you're going to want to be aware of is that if you do that, when you have a drainage area that has directly connected impervious area, you're going to be underestimating your runoff. Possibly you could calculate a curve number that results in no runoff, even though you have directly connected impervious area. So just a quick question, can you have no runoff from a site that has directly connected impervious area? What do you think? Yeah, no. Little caveat, in the curve number method, the curve number for impervious is 98. So it still kind of accounts for, you know, water soaking into the concrete or whatever your impervious area is. So you could still potentially have a non-runoff event, but a very, very, very slim chance. We are, though, accounting for a little bit of storage and a little bit of stuff being lost from hitting a hot roof and evaporating or getting into the concrete, but generally no. So that's why what you need to do instead is you calculate the runoff from your pervious areas and from your directly connected impervious areas separately. You treat them like two different sites. Then you add them together. Now, if you use HMS to do this, HMS actually has an option in the curve number method to specify a directly connected percentage. If you do that, that's what HMS is doing in the background. It's actually saying we're not going to account for any losses in concrete. It's going to use like a curve number of 100, right? So everything, it's just going to say basically for the area that is directly connected impervious, my full rainfall is turning into runoff. So that's a little bit more conservative. You're more than welcome to do that. We're going to go through a hand calculation that gives you a little bit of benefit. But this is, you may not have ever heard of this before, but this is commonly done. And this is how we at Bowen Collins do it for master planning. We'll make an assumption for certain subbasins on what their percent impervious is, and we will calculate the directly connected from the unconnected, disconnected separately when we're developing our master plans. It's a best practice that we've found in the years we've been doing it. Okay, so first we're going to develop runoff with roofs connected. We're going to take a little side and we're going to look at, we have lawn and we have rock mulch. So lawn has one pervious number, in this case 80, and then natural desert landscaping, which would be your gravel mulch and your shrubs, it's got an 88. So we're going to compute a composite of those two for just our pervious areas, and that's okay to use a weighted average here like you've typically done. We're going to come up with a composite of 83 for this site. So when we're doing our pervious area, we're gonna use 83. Same calculation as before, except now we're using a curve number in that S equation of 83 instead of 86. Now when we run through this, we're still gonna get a little bit of runoff, but it's almost nothing. It's 0.0004. It calculates to 0. So what we're saying is that with your roofs connected, any rain from 0.44 inches of rain on your remaining pervious area is gonna just infiltrate or evapotranspire, or it's not gonna turn into runoff in this case. That'll be different for every site. Okay, now we're gonna calculate the impervious area, the runoff for the impervious areas. So in this case, our roof and our driveway and our sidewalk. Okay, because our roof we're assuming is discharging to a yard drain or directly to a driveway. We're gonna go through this again. We're using now a curve number of 98 for impervious area. And then I guess the other thing you should look is go through these calculations, look at your total impervious area. That's where you're gonna plug that number in. And you're gonna convert that over to 141 cubic feet in this case. So from this site, and we add up those two together, in this case, it's only coming from the impervious area. So from this one lot, for 0.44 inches or the 80th percentile, we have 141 cubic feet of water we can expect to run off from this site. Okay, so that was our roofs connected condition. Now we're gonna throw you another loop. This is gonna be different. You gotta think about this. We're gonna use a two-step calculation method. Really, there's more steps than that, but we call it two-step because what you're gonna do first is you're gonna calculate your runoff from your roofs only. Okay, you're gonna only use the area of the roofs. You're gonna use a curve number of 98. And then you're gonna take whatever you calculate from that, and you're gonna say that's running now onto my pervious area, and it's spreading out and it's flowing across that pervious area. So that pervious area sees the same 0.44 inches of rain that the roof saw, but it also sees an additional amount of rainfall that's coming from the roof. So we're kind of saying we're converting that runoff from the downspouts into additional rain on the remaining downstream pervious areas. So if you think about it, it really kind of makes a lot of sense. This is pulled from a New Jersey manual. Now, you might say that the New Jersey methods are probably not applicable to an arid location. I'm not making any claim that it is or it isn't, but conceptually, this idea of converting your rainfall from your roofs, as long as it's adequately spread out as sheet flow, and putting it on some downstream pervious area. I'll just speak louder. Hopefully you can hear me. Play some musical chairs with the microphones.
Speak loud for a second.
Okay, I'll just keep going. So calculate the runoff from the remaining pervious and impervious areas using the weighting. So we're gonna take the roofs, put that on the pervious areas, then calculate the pervious area, and then calculate our remaining impervious area. So really it's kind of a three-step method. New Jersey calls it a two-step method, but you're doing roofs, pervious, remaining impervious, minus the roofs, because we already accounted for those. Again, calculations that I could go through, but the main takeaway here is you just got to say, okay, this is just my roof area. So I'm going to add up my roof area. And actually, if you look back at my aerial there, I had some sidewalks that were flowing onto a lawn or some other pervious area. So I added those in there too, because those are really disconnected already just by virtue of the topography and the way the site's laid out. So my total is 0.126 acres. No, we're still good. You guys can hear me, right? I think Zoom can hear me because they're going off the microphone here, I think. Let's just see. Testing, testing. Yep. I got some bars showing that they're hearing something. Okay, so I calculated just the runoff from my roofs. I'm getting 121 cubic feet. Before I was getting 141 cubic feet. That's kind of a hint. Most of this runoff was coming from the roof because it was the big impervious area on this site. Okay, now I have to take another step and I have to convert that depth that I just calculated, that 121 cubic feet, and convert it back into, I have to take the volume and convert it back into a depth and add it to my 0.44 inches. So I'm going to take the area, take that volume, 121 cubic feet, divided by the area of my pervious that it's going to flow onto. And then you got to do some units magic, which you can follow in here. I'm going to get 0.4 inches. So rain that hits that roof turns into 0.4 inches that is added to the 0.44 to turn into 0.84 for the remaining pervious area. So now I'm going to go through that pervious area calculation once again. And I'm going to say, again, my curve number was 83 for pervious area, but now when I get to runoff volume, it's in bold there, I'm going to use 0.84 instead of 0.44 because I have that extra runoff from the roofs. Okay, now for my pervious area, before I was getting 0 or just less than 1. Now I'm getting 22 cubic feet of runoff from my pervious area. So I increased the runoff coming from my pervious area, but I now don't have to take that 121 cubic feet into my final number because it's gone and it's now evapotranspirated or lost somewhere in the pervious area. So that 121 has turned into 22. So you can see that's quite the reduction. We still have one more thing. We got the driveways and the sidewalks that are still directly connected. We can't unconnect them unless we did some sort of swale between the sidewalk and the driveway and the road. So we got to do that calculation one more time. Now, if you take the roofs out, we're going to do the same calculation. The roofs are gone. We're just using the area, the driveway and the sidewalks. We're going to end up with 20 cubic feet. So when it's all said and done, we took the rain from the roofs, put it on the pervious area, we got 22 cubic feet. Took the rain on the directly connected impervious, the driveway and the sidewalks, we got 22 cubic feet. Sorry, 20 cubic feet. We're gonna add those two together and we got 42 cubic feet. So to sum it all up, with on this one particular site with roofs connected, we got 141 cubic feet of runoff. When we disconnected the roofs and allowed them to just sheet flow across the landscaping, we only had 42 cubic feet. So we reduced the runoff by 99 cubic feet or 70%. In your type A, B, and C soils, this percentage is even higher. There's a summary table in the LID manual, but I'm going to need to issue a correction because in that manual, it just kind of used the type D soils everywhere on one of the rows, so it's not quite right. But the percentage reductions that are listed in that table range from like 85% to 70% for this particular site. So it really makes sense to use the right type of soil. I mean, a lot of times engineers like to just use a type D because they think it's going to be conservative, but in this case, more runoff is worse, right? So we want to store less water on site. So it's really beneficial to use your A, B, or C, what it actually is. Okay, so that was the site-specific method. And I ran through it really quick, and I know that you're not going to understand it just from that real quick run through, but at the end of the day, what you got to understand is all you're doing is saying, I'm going to rain on the roof. That runoff is going to convert to something on top of the pervious area, and I'm going to rain on those two plus the roof, and then I'm going to get a number. The difference between that number and the first number of everything connected, all the roof and the rain, that's your reduction. So you can confidently say, I'm estimating I'm going to reduce it by X cubic feet or X percentage. Now there is a approximate method that we put in the manual, and what it was based on was, all these site analyses that we did, we looked at the percent reduction and kind of tried to pick something that would be conservative and that it would underrepresent the actual reduction you're getting. So you're not counting on more reduction than you're actually going to get. So use the approximate method if you want something quick and dirty, but if you want the most bang for your buck, do a site-specific analysis and you'll find that you probably have more reduction in runoff than you do with the approximate method. There's a couple other conditions, and these conditions are based on the limited analysis we did with these 10 or 15 sites that we did. The site is a single residential lot with land cover similar in type in proportion to the sites used in this study. So I know that these are really limiting caveats, and you could, as an engineer, adapt these for your preliminary stuff to get an idea if it's even worth going down the site-specific analysis. But if you're trying to submit this as an actual BMP, we don't have the data to say that for a big subdivision, you can just multiply by this factor and get your reduction. We only have the data for the single lots that we looked at. We could develop other data in the future, maybe we will, but we didn't yet. And then your percent impervious has to be less than 65 because there were no sites that we use that were less than 65, I think, in this particular case. And then you've got to have some lawn on your site. At least 20% of your lot has to be lawn in good condition, because again, the sites that we looked at, that's what they had in them. So the approximate method, it's the same as the site-specific method until you get to step 6. So you're still going to do your undeveloped runoff. You're still going to do your roof-connected runoff. But instead of doing that 2/3-step method, what you're going to do is you're going to take this table and look, what soil type am I and what reduction factor do I have? In our case, we're type D. We're going to use 0.55. We're just going to take the runoff from our roofs connected, multiply by 0.55, and we're going to say, okay, we're reducing the runoff down to 78 cubic feet. So we're reducing it by 63 cubic feet, which is that 141 minus 78, or a 55% reduction. Well, you guys saw that in the site-specific analysis, we actually calculated a 70% reduction, or a 99 cubic feet reduction. So we didn't quite get all the credit that we deserved for disconnecting those roofs. That's why the site-specific analysis is going to help you out better than this approximate one. And this is real quick and dirty. You do your normal curve number analysis, multiply by this factor, and you got an idea of, yeah, okay, I'm going to reduce it by 55%. I'm going to go ahead and, you don't even really need to do the analysis, because you could look at the table and it's going to say I'm going to reduce it by 55, right? Okay, we got a question.
Will that be acceptable to the city? They'll have to go for site specific, do they want site specific calculations coming showing that, or can you say, hey, I just ran through?
So the question is the approximate method acceptable to a city? I think yes, it's acceptable. But at the end of the day, what you're going to be doing, and I don't need that slide's not, we're going to go into questions, but at the end of the day, what you're going to do is you're going to take this number that you calculated and say, okay, instead of providing a BMP that now stores 141 cubic feet, maybe now I only need to do a BMP that stores the difference, right? So what was it? It was, we reduced it by 70% minus 99. We had 42 CFS, or 42 cubic feet still that we are still running off from our site, right? Well, now you're going to look and maybe put another BMP in that captures that. Maybe you're doing this on a site level and you're doing it in your detention pond, but now your retention area in your detention pond is now much smaller because each of your individual lots are spread out and not running off as much as they were before. So the city could come back and say, sure, use the approximate method, but you still have X cubic feet of water running off. Why can't you, or what have you done to justify that you can't provide another BMP to store that remainder? Does that make sense? So this is technically another BMP you could use. It's not quite translatable to the other methods that are in the state manual because they use runoff coefficient versus curve number. But I think most cities in the area are going to look at this as another tool in the toolkit as far as BMPs. And if you show them, hey, I calculated this, and we're going to say on our plat map that all lots developed here have to be can't have their roof drains connected, and they're going to meet the requirements of the city or the stormwater coalition for disconnected impervious area, then they would probably say, okay, then you only have to retain this much with the remainder. And if you can't do that and you've justified it and you got a technical and feasibility, then you're good to go. Okay, so I'm a little bit over. I started a little bit late. Does anybody else have any questions? Okay, yeah.
So would this take place if you can live, like the manual has the water quality retention volume? So that this would just be another general way of calculating the retention volume versus.
Okay, so the question is this a way to calculate water quality retention volume? No, because water quality retention volume is the state is going to look at that and say, if you got to do that calculation using the runoff coefficient and say, I got to retain this based on what the state is telling me, right? It's based off your runoff coefficient and your area, and that's a volume. You could use this, and maybe this shows that you're exceeding that water quality retention volume. If that's the case, then it's up to the city, but probably what they're going to say is, okay, you met your water quality retention volume in our eyes because you calculated 100 cubic feet based off the runoff coefficient and you retain 99 cubic feet, right? So it's within the margin of error, so you're good. Any other questions? Tom,
You calculated it for grass, is there any other sort of medium that they do the same thing, like if they were to zero scape that had permeable weed barrier?
yeah, so I technically didn't do it just for grass. That was that one step that we did at the beginning where we did the weighted average of the remaining pervious area. We lumped the xeriscape gravel area. We called that natural desert landscaping, right? That's typically what I would recommend using for the xeriscaping if it's got a permeable weed barrier, which most developers are putting impermeable. We're really not going to want to see impermeable weed barrier on anything because that's going to just jack your runoff way up. But we accounted for that. If you had no grass and you just had natural desert landscaping, you would just use the curve number for natural desert landscaping and not have to do the combined one, right? So we tried to account for it that way. I'm not saying that it's exact science, right? It's hydrology. But
I guess what I'm saying is, could you sheet flow on desert scape instead of grass?
yes,
And still get a reduction?
yes, I'm saying that, yeah, I'm saying that we're accounting for that by using a runoff number associated with, we're kind of saying, you know, but also by having that requirement that we are limiting it to 600 square feet, we're ensuring that these roof drains are spread out across the site, not just all flowing off one area. So you're going to have a little bit of mix of both, right? You're going to have some going over grass if you have grass on your site, some on gravel, some on shrubs. But if you had a site that was all xeriscaped, I think you'd be, as long as it's non-erosive. So that's why you need the flow spreader, right? But yeah, I think you can do that. It killed me.
What is what was the determination between the 25-foot requirement for the flow spread distance now?
It's just based on what other jurisdictions have done and have found and used as their minimums. We don't have empirical data, you know, that shows that that's what we need, but that's what we felt comfortable with putting on there as a minimum was 25 feet. Sorry, and the question, it's kind of a jeopardy here. The question was, what was the basis for the 25-foot requirement for the spreading? Okay, Jay.
Does it necessarily have to be a straight line, or could it be circular or zigzag?
It could, but what you're going to want to look at, and we didn't kind of give a minimum width, but what you want to avoid doing is channelizing it. You want to keep it as flat and spread out as possible, right? Because once you channelize it, you're getting way less bang for your buck as far as infiltration goes. Because now only that first ½ inch of water is in the gravel and is really infiltrating, right? So yeah, you could have a big wide area with kind of a gradient to it, but it'd be kind of challenging to do that, I think. It's probably more common that you're going to have a flat spreader in a flat area that you're going over. And Jay's question was, could you have a meandering path or a longer distance and use a curve? Jay has another one.
Undimensional somewhat, but if you're flattening, if you have a natural slope of a subdivision, say 6%, but the slopes not flat, just take into account that in all of these calculations. So the lots get graded out, and they're all maybe 2% after slope.
I mean, so the question is, does it take into account the change that you made to the, because if originally it was like 6% in the ungraded condition, and now it's got flat lots, and so your average slope is 1 to 2%. I mean, this method doesn't directly account for that, but there's a way you could probably work that into a site-wide analysis if you wanted to. It's really kind of geared on looking at the individual lots for disconnecting the impervious area. It doesn't quite really address that concern. I know there's probably more questions, but we're over. So come talk to me afterwards. But we're now going to run back over to the other room, and we're going to have a city panel. I mean, originally we were going to end at 1 because some of our city had to go to a flood control authority meeting, but I don't know if that's happening today, right? It's next week, right? So maybe if people can stick around, we might be able to go a little bit over, but we still want to try to limit it to a ½ hour. So we'll run over there, and then we'll have a little city panel. Each city will talk a little bit about their view of this and how this is going to go down in their city, and we'll open it up for a few questions. Thanks.
What's that? I do? Why is that? So the computer has the camera on it? Yeah, that's the camera. Lester, did you watch it? It's Rick. Rick's up there. Lester. I guess they could have,
All right. Sorry, we're a little bit behind. We're going to try to get going so we can honor people's schedules. So this is our city panel. We've got Chuck Gillette from Ivan City, Public Works Director. We've got Christy Schultz from St. George City is the Stormwater Coordinator for the city. Myself, I'll be kind of speaking for Santa Clara as the City Engineer Development Reviewer. Rick Schneider from Washington City, City Engineer, and Brandon Wright, who's going to be also speaking for Washington City, right? Okay, team effort. All right, so what we're going to do, members, is just take a couple minutes, 2 to 3 minutes, and just kind of give your perspective and what you see your city doing with these new guidelines. So we'll start with Chuck.
All right, I'll go first then. So I didn't know I was going to do this, so I got to think for a second. But basically, any new subdivision that comes in, and we haven't had. Tom, correct me if I'm wrong. Where's Tom? Where'd Tom go? I don't think we've had a new application come in since July 1st that I can think of, at least, that's going to fall under these regulations. But anybody that submitted their concept plan after July 1st, they'd have to start implementing these regulations. In our mind, we're expecting to see the calculations on the hydrology be done with the drainage study that's required. We expect the geotechnical analysis to have a section that covers LID and any restrictions that might need to be enforced. As you know, obviously they always put in items in the geotechnical report, like keep the drainage away from the structures. And so we will be interested in having a section address that particular issue, how this LID might impact structures, since we're trying to infiltrate water into the ground, and whether or not we can do that close to structures. Also the soil and the soil type and the infiltration capabilities of those soils, that will all be something we're going to be looking for in the geotechnical studies. In Ivan City, all those studies are submitted at preliminary plan. So in our perspective, we won't be, as a technical review committee, we won't be passing on that preliminary plan until we're satisfied that it's met an understanding. And I don't know how the other cities are. It seems like Ivan City's requirements preliminary plan, it's almost a 90% design. And so at preliminary plan, you're going to have the studies done, and then you're going to have a plan of how you're going to implement the LID. So you're going to identify the BMPs that are going to go in, and you're going to tell us how that meets the water quality volumes, and all of that will be in the preliminary plan. And basically we won't be approving that until we have that pretty well defined. I think that's it.
So just real quick, Chuck, has Ivan City adopted this into their ordinance?
we are enforcing it. We don't really have an ordinance that says that it's technically adopted, but we're enforcing it because it's part of our permit.
All right, Christie?
So the city of St. George, first of all, we just wanted to let you know that we appreciate your patience in all this. This is not city, the whole coalition can vouch for that this is not a city requirement. It is a state and EPA requirement. So we appreciate your patience. This has been hard on us as well. We are going to have a process. We're at preliminary plat as well. We want to see the stormwater quality report template filled out with the BMPs that are going to be associated with your calculations, and then a map, a drawing that will pinpoint what the expected BMPs are going to be and where their locations are. As mentioned, we'll be looking at, the soils reports and everything associated with that, and look at that all at the preliminary plat stage. We have adopted an ordinance. We also have an existing ordinance say that we comply with the state's regulations. So that's already in effect, but we also put an LID requirement in our city ordinances. I believe that we've had 2 submittals since our July 1st implementation. And so, as Chuck said, we're going to just kind of work our way through it.
Okay, thanks. So for Santa Clara City, we're kind of just doing the same thing as the other cities, trying to match them as close as possible. But, we don't have a ton of subdivisions going on at any one time. Right now, we have one that has kind of been in progress since the July 1st requirement. And we are going to be enforcing it on that and working with the engineer and the developer on that. It's going to be kind of a learning process as we go through these first couple, I think. I think it's going to be a little bit painful, but I think that after that, it's going to drop off. I think the learning curve is not going to be quite as steep as we all think. Santa Clara has adopted the Dixie Stormwater Coalition manual in their ordinance. So it's in effect now in their ordinance. So that's why we're now enforcing it and going to be reviewing it. Now we're going to probably not require a specific drawing for the LID BMPs. We may be, depending on the size of the subdivision, we'll make that call, but generally we see you putting that on your drainage and grading plan, just like you've done in the past, except now you're going to be adding BMPs and a retention or something on there. And again, we're looking at this stuff. I don't know that we're asking for it to all be finalized at preliminary plat, but that's when we're going to start looking at it, is we want to see it with the drainage report and just have a section in the drainage report that addresses LID when you would typically submit your drainage report. And then there is, as Christy mentioned, there's some forms in the manual that will help you to help document. So we encourage you to use that. I don't know that we're going to play it by ear and see how that works, but those tools are available. And so if you do use that, it's going to make the reviews a lot easier and a lot smoother in a way for it, and it'll be easier for us to document it. Washington City?
So we're very similar to what you've heard from these other cities. I think the biggest thing for us different is our city council is very concerned with what would happen if this were implemented at a per residence basis. They're just worried about the annual report requirements that it puts on the house and 5-year inspections by the city and what that does. So their preference would be to see it handled at a subdivision level, similar to like storm drain requirements, which are still in place. We are working with one developer on a project right now that we're kind of filling it out. And I won't say anyone's name. They're doing a great job, but it worked out to be about 1 inch more storage in their basins, which is great, because then they can handle it on a development-wide level. Not to say wouldn't allow it. It's just that's their concern.
Ben, you don't have anything to add? Okay, so that's kind of how each of the 4 cities feel about it. We have 10 minutes till we're supposed to be done. We'll see how many questions there are and how we're going. But if you have questions for a specific city, if you come up to the mic, it'll prevent us from having to restate the question. So if you do, come up to the mic real quick, that might help us out. So open it up for questions. Jack. Okay, so Jack corrected me for Santa Clara City. We are going to require the sheets. It's all right.
Also letting you know that these sheets and these resources are all available. I think it's been mentioned in a couple of presentations, but if you Google the Dixie Stormwater Coalition, there's a tab or a section completely devoted to LID. So all of these forms and reports and the manual and everything are on that location in the website.
And like I said, I have links to the websites in my presentation, and I'll email that out to everybody that I have an email address for. Questions? Concerns? Frustrations?
Washington City's, the council's concerned about the impacts to the single-family homeowner. Who's going to be over maintenance of all these individual LID systems?
So you just want to hear from each city.
Yeah.
How you handle
Are
it.
you going to do maintenance going forward? I can see where HOAs are going to become maybe the mainstay, even in single-family housing projects. Historically in Washington County, if an HOA is only responsible for landscaping, it really sucks at what it does. People don't like HOAs in the front yards checking their grass line sheet flow areas, for example, or if I want to change my lawn to something else. How are you going to handle that?
I'll go first.
Go for it, Chuck.
So Ivan City, and so we don't have any precedent to go off of, so it's me making it up. But Ivan City for detention basins, maintenance has always been, if it's in an arterial, if you put the detention basin in the landscape buffer of an arterial or a major collector street, then Ivan City takes care of maintenance of not just the landscaping in those areas, but also any detention basins that are placed in those zones. And then anywhere else, it's up to a subdivision to form an HOA and take care of maintenance that way. And then obviously the permit requires the city to get some sort of confirmation from whoever's responsible for maintenance for once a year, some sort of report. And then the city's going to be required to do their own inspections once every 5 years. And that's how I understand it. We'll see how well it goes.
So if you're an engineer, now you can market those HOAs and say, hey, I'll do your manual stormwater report for you.
I think commercial subdivisions, HOAs, I don't think are going to be too difficult. We'll already be getting the maintenance agreement we do now for the city of St. George, and we will moving forward. The challenges is going to be in single residential lots, not within an HOA. What we're anticipating at this time is probably send out an annual, well, there'll be provisions like on the recorded plat. It will mention that they've got LID on their lot and it needs to be maintained as part of the recording of the plat. Is how we expect to see that done. But we will probably send out an annual letter letting homeowners know. I mean, we'll word it, but it'll be something on the lines of, you probably didn't even know you got LID on your project or your property. However, you do, and it does need to be maintained and it does need to be recorded upon. Here's a form, here's a link, here's an online process where you can record they'll have to self-inspect. It's going to be a challenge. There's no way around it. It's going to be a big task for the city to undertake, but it's required by the state. And as you all know, you have to do things regardless if it's required by the state.
So Rick's asking how we're going to pay for the follow-up on the maintenance.
Right. it will be, you know, I don't know the answer to that right now. Where we'll have staff that will, it'll be very time consuming. It probably won't do it throughout the whole year. We'll probably just mass mail out this letters and we'll mass calculate how much of it we're getting back. We'll have to do our 5-year inspections. So it's going to be a little heavy handed at different times throughout the year, but I think that we're just going to have to do it. And then if we find that we can't maintain it with the current staff that we have, we will absolutely have to consider increasing our staff for that.
Okay. Well, Jack, can you answer the question? Because I'm not involved in operations. And then you'll have a maintenance agreement and have an HOA or something, which you've done in the past. Okay. How about Washington City?
So this is a tough one. So it took us a couple months before we actually, our city council actually adopted it. And what it comes down to is you need someone that has somewhat of a technical expertise to even do the report. And then it has to be someone that has the authority to do something about it. And then they have to have some money if they need to make it. And so what happens if someone's not turning in their reports, you know, and the city gets audited? Obviously we have to do something about it, you know, and so we don't want to get into the point where we're spending all our time policing stuff that the average homeowner has no idea about or you know, can afford to do anything about if they inherited a problem or whatnot. So we're looking for, like, on commercial, we feel fairly comfortable that commercial properties, the owners are going to understand that it takes a maintenance cost and they need to get experts in to handle things. So we're not too concerned about that. HOAs, I think at least you have the community in, you know, the subdivision, and the HOAs have authority and generally they have a little bit of money saved up. So we, you know, that area where not ideal, I think would be a lot better than each individual homeowner. Because I'd hate to be the one to say, hey, you haven't turned in your report for 3 years. You know, what are you talking about?
The permit does say that they've reduced it to every other year. Then you have to worry about, you're challenged with keeping track of who you're getting every other year. And so it might be easier to send that out annually and then try to get the majority the best you can on that every other year requirement. But by requesting it once a year, we can try to get as many as we can on that capture.
Any other questions, thoughts, suggestions? Can you come up to the mic?
Does the city have the authority to mandate that each subdivision that comes in do it in a regional detention basin versus to try to eliminate the per lot problem? I know the state is really pushing for this micromanaged. That's the best way to clean up the water, obviously, but to do it per lot, per landscape area. But like you guys have said, it's going to be a bureaucratic mess trying to track it all.
Well, I don't know if the state's necessarily pushing the per site idea. I mean,
Well, just looking at the
way the BMPs are structured,
yeah,
they're really kind of smaller and geared towards individuals.
You have to go all the way to the technically infeasible method to even get to the retention portion. So I was just wondering if the cities itself can require doing it in a subdivision-wide solution to eliminate all these questions that we have right now.
I think they could, but they have to accept 5 different types of BMPs.
Yeah.
So whether or not there are 5 types that are
That could be.
regional sort of.
You could probably figure.
Probably there are.
Maybe.
There probably are, yeah.
Well, and it wouldn't necessarily be that we're looking for a big solution.
Mhm.
You know, as an HOA, they could require that, hey,
The 5 small ones.
yeah,
But at
each
least
house
you're dealing
shall
with
do
one
this, and then
and
they can be the ones to.
Well, HOAs have a lot of common area and things where they can gather spots, you know, your clustering and stuff like that that you can do. So I
Just-
think the layout of HOAs is not that
This is,
problematic.
this is really just a giant conspiracy theory. We're just trying to make it rain. So we figure if we put these LIDs in, it'd be like a rain dance kind of thing.
If you build it, it will come.
Yeah, that's all it is.
I do find the more money you spend on storm drains, the less it rains, so.
You got another question?
I might just be wondering, do you think that the cities might develop any sort of maybe collective website where maybe subdivisions or individual lots could kind of have their inspections stored? So maybe new homeowners can access those if you did have to do the single lots, and they can kind of see the history of it in that way. It might help out companies as well in developing plans or structures for that and help keep track of things in that way.
It's a good suggestion.
I mean, a lot of the cities already have GIS infrastructure in place, and that could be easily incorporated into an aspect of that GIS that could be a public facing website. So I think it's a good idea. I don't know that we have any plans right now to do it, but I think that it's a good idea that we should consider.
I could see that my city inspector could set up something like that.
Yeah, we use Software City Inspect and it very well. Homeowners just need to know, and we're going to get a lot of it, and we're anticipating and expecting it, that they just don't even know they have LID on their property. And clearly it's going to be on their plat or some other form of legal agreement. And so they have to know that the requirements are there before they've got a resource to go looking for it as well.
Yeah, I think the cities are going to have to step up their public outreach quite a bit.
Absolutely.
And I know St. George City does pretty well in their floodplain outreach for the community rating system. So they'll have to do something similar to that with the mailings and advertising. And then maybe the coalition will come together for some sort of outreach campaign, but it's going to be a learning process for all the cities moving forward. So are we going to inspect it or require as-builts?
The permit requires it. The permit requires that we look at it at a pre-construction phase, during construction, that they are installed as plans, and post-construction. So we've got a permit requires it that we look through it all stages.
Need Scott walking around with the wireless mic.
On a subdivision, you're going to do it at preliminary plat, you're going to do it at construction plans, you're going to design it all out. Then the subdivision is going to get built, and there's going to be this interim period before the homes come in. And I'm talking, well, single family and PUD type stuff. There's going to be that interim period where there's nothing out there. So you're going to have your construction BMPs in place. So when the homeowner does build, the homeowner will be responsible for the as-built on the LID.
If the facility is a lot-specific facility. Right?
Or if it's a HOA, or they all have to be built up front when it's platted?
I think that's how you handle detention basins, isn't it?
Well, I'm thinking like a Sun River. They're basically single lot subdivisions with an HOA, so it could have a mix of regional ones and individual ones. But it's going to get built similar to a subdivision, one home at a time. What I'm trying to figure out is when we're doing work for the homeowners or for the HOAs, do we need to build as-builts? Are you going to go to the level? I know Washington's pretty close on their stormwater stuff where we require as-builts on any detention basins before they get the permit. Are we going to start doing that on individual houses?
In individual houses, we have a program in the city of St. George where we have a common plan of development, SWIP. So they've got to provide their drawings. We'd probably require that anything that's any LID that has been forth, had the thought of having that on the individual lots, that would be on their site map drawings. So we would look at that when we're looking at the SWIP approval for those individual lots. And then at the notice of termination inspection as well, we would make sure that it's, I'm not sure at the NOT inspection, but maybe we'll have a drainage inspection or something like that. That's going to be when the landscaping gets in, and we'll look at that close to the notice of termination inspection.
Because there's a big education getting the developers on board.
It is.
But that's a little teeny step compared to getting the landscapers on board.
Yes.
The last guys that are in the subdivision building these things so they actually work as they're designed.
Right.
They're not in the game right now.
And like Clint mentioned, there's going to be a huge public outreach that we're going to have to reach out to a variety of people, including landscapers.
Landscapers usually don't look at plans. is my-
Exactly. Thank you.
I think that's a good point, because at least up front, there's, there's COs and stuff that can motivate things to get done. But, what about 3 years down the road when so-and-so adds an RV pad to the side of the house and takes out all the LID measures, then what? Then what do you do to get them back?
I don't know. I can't vouch for the state, but I think there's got to be a little level of realistic expectations with things like that.
Okay, let's just make it our last question, but Jared's got a question.
Have you guys had a chance to look at other municipalities, maybe up north or even like Clark County, as far as how they're trying to implement these sorts of issues?
I think the coalition, did look at that as they were going on, but I don't know that we've done a detailed analysis of any one particular municipality. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Now, they've given us a lot of examples from up north, going to curbless subdivision roadways, landscape strips, a lot of things of that nature.
I think Spanish Fork put in like an underground storage that then had permeable holes
They
in
use
it.
R tanks, or basically milk crates. in
Yeah,
their
there's those
park
milk
strips.
crates that they've been putting in, and there's been some examples we've seen. I don't know about Clark County. That'd be interesting to see how they're trying to implement it.
We chose to consult with J.E. Fuller for the manual based on the fact that they're out of Phoenix and a very similar climate. So we wanted to glean their expertise from down there as well.
Is anyone here developed in Clark County? Any ideas of what they're doing?
I think it's really kind of a learn as you go for us right now.
I'm not sure Clark County's,
They've
where
gotta be
we
doing
are. They
something.
might be behind us. I don't know.
Yeah. These, like we said, these requirements are coming from the EPA to the states, and then from the states to the municipalities. So everyone in the country is going to get hit with them eventually. Just
Yeah, and I think the EPA is rolling it out on a state-by-state basis. I don't know how it works. I know there's some states that are maybe a decade ahead of us, and there's some that haven't been hit by this yet. I don't know what's going on exactly.
Okay, well, I'm going to call it for our panel members. Thanks, everybody, for participating. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Hopefully, it was beneficial. Expect to get an email from me sometime this week with a follow-up with the presentation. And then I'll have my contact information if you need to get anything from me. And then, again, for the ASCE members, plan on October 23rd. It's a Friday at like 1 o'clock, Vernon Worthen Park. We're going to have a family barbecue. Your families are welcome to attend. Like I said, we've reserved the pickleball courts. We'll bring a couple lawn games. I think we tried to reserve the volleyball courts. I don't know if I got them or not. I need to confirm with the city. But we're hoping that's going to be kind of a fun thing that we haven't really done in the past. So hope to see you there. Thanks, everybody.